It's very simple. I mean, if you look at your own addictions, those of you, and most of you raised your hand, and when you gave it up for a while and then you relapsed, what usually happened that caused the relapse? Usually something stressful happened. So it was your way of dealing with stress. So it follows that the more you stress people, the more you entrench them in their addictions. So create a system that ostracizes and punishes and torments people and exiles them from society. You're just making sure that they're going to stay addicted, that's all. According to the President's Commission on Addiction, on the opioid crisis, and by the way, even when we talk about the opioid crisis, it's a rather arbitrary determination, not because it isn't a crisis. I mean, it is. According to the President's own advisory commission, every 3 weeks you have a 9/11 happening in the United States as a result of illegal drug overdoses.
And we're just talking. Anxiety.
Relief from anxiety. In other words, inner peace. So right away when you understand that, you get that the addiction wasn't your problem. Your addiction was your attempt to solve the problem. And the real question is, how did that problem develop? How come it's 7 billion human beings in the world you felt lonely? How come you lacked a sense of agency, control, authority in your life? Why were you in so much emotional pain? And everything you've said, the loneliness, the lack of power, the lack of control, the anxiety, these are forms of emotional pain. So my mantra around addiction is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And this is where we can talk more about it, but as you and I both know, the current model of addiction is either the legal one, which says it's a choice that people make and therefore we have to punish them for it, or it's the medical one, in which case it's an inherited brain disease. But it isn't either of those things. What it actually is an attempt to solve a human life problem, that of emotional pain, loneliness, distress, anxiety, whatever it is. And the real question then is, what happened in my life, or your life, Joe, or everybody else's lives here, that we incurred pain? And then how do we deal with our pain? Because the addiction itself magnifies the pain, it multiplies it, it increases it exponentially. So it begins in pain, as Eckhart Tolle, the spiritual teacher, says, addictions begin in pain and they end in pain. Both my addictions, the work was very respectable. It got me nothing but praise and income. And it created deep problems in my family, you know. And then my shopping addiction, well, he's a lover of classical music. Isn't that wonderful? You know, but some of the respectable addictions, and I say this somewhat hesitatingly, but I'll say it anyway in front of a business audience, had to do with profit and power, where for some people, nothing is ever enough. And it's not, and it's not because they're bad people, but because they're trying to stuff a hole inside themselves. And then that can cause serious damage in the world, such as we're seeing with the environment and climate change and other pollution and other issues. You know, so or in addition to power, like I'm just reading a biography of Napoleon, and Napoleon was a genius. He really, when you talk about genius, that was a genius for you, in so many ways. But he was also totally addicted to power. And even in exile, he said, "I love power," and he called power his mistress. Well, a lot of people died because of addiction to power. And yet, you know, he's a hero, he's respected. Whereas the substance addict who shoots up heroin in the back alley is ostracized and discarded from society. So, yeah, there's the respectable addictions, and then there's these arbitrarily chosen addicts on whom we project all our disdain and all our self-judgment, basically, the stuff we don't like about themselves, we project it onto these other people. And
Being a drug addict.
And what was that in your case? Cocaine, was it? Or what?
It was cocaine.
If I may interrupt, there was something else here too. So I'll talk about myself and I'll talk about you.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my addictions has been to work. In fact, that's a continued challenge for me, if you look at my travel schedule. So I got a certain message from the world. I was born in Budapest, Hungary, 1944. Jewish parents, 2 months before the Nazis occupy Hungary. So I spent the first year of my life with my mother under Nazi rule, and she was in terror the whole year, as you can imagine. Parents killed in Auschwitz and so on. My father was away in forced labor. The message I got from the world is that the world didn't want me. Not because Hitler didn't want me, because I didn't know Hitler. But my mother wasn't happy. And children are narcissists in the developmental sense. They take everything personally. So when the bad things are happening, it must be about me. And if she's not happy around me, Thich Nhat Hanh, the spiritual teacher, says that the greatest gift parents can give their children is their own happiness. And you're getting validation every moment. And what it is a compensation for the sense of not being wanted that I've never dealt with. Now in your case, you got a message as well, that you're wanted through your body. You're wanted through your body. You're wanted when you're sexually available. That's the message you get. Yeah. What are you going to do? So, especially if you look at men who are sex addicts and women who are sex addicts, there's no such thing as a what's the word, an nymphomaniac. That's just a slander. What it really is women, or sometimes men, who've learned that only through their bodies and only through the sexual act are they actually wanted. Well, that's really addictive, because we all need to be wanted. Yeah. And I think that's also what's behind it. Yeah. Well, if you look at the criminal justice system, it's really based on this idea that, as I said earlier, that addiction is a choice that somebody makes. If somebody's not making a conscious choice, what are you doing punishing them? Yeah. You don't punish people because they're suffering and they're trying to escape from their pain. You help them. Right. Instead of making them criminals. And number one. Number two, it's very arbitrary as to what we decide should be legal or illegal, because give me 1,000 heroin addicts who inject 4 times a day in a quantity that does not lead to an overdose, and give me 1,000 people who smoke a pack a day, and another 1,000 who drink heavily. Guess which 1,000 is going to be the healthiest and the longest living at the end of 30 years? By far the heroin group. So by far, I'm talking medical facts here. So by some, I'm not saying that heroin should be legalized and sold in corner stores like cigarettes. But I am saying that the decision to criminalize it is utterly arbitrary. And it's nothing to do with either science or logic or humanity. Okay, all right. Yeah. Yeah, so she works in the emergency ward at a Detroit hospital. And she graduated in '05. From medical school in Michigan. And I asked her, how many lectures on emotional trauma did you receive? Not a single one. How many lectures on how the human brain develops in interaction with the environment did you receive? Not one. Yeah. Which is the same with me when I went to medical school, I don't know, 40-odd years ago. And so what I'm saying is that the medical world utterly misunderstands the problem and don't get any training in understanding human psychology, and the same thing is true of many of the programs where people go for addiction. So they never deal with the core issue, they only deal with the behavior of addiction, but the behavior is only a symptom. Yes, it is. First of all, let me make a point that occurred to me when you were talking about your marijuana use and your cocaine use. Those are typical self-medications for ADD, because the marijuana calms down the hyperactive mind. And if you get treated for ADD, what do they give you? They give you a stimulant, which elevates dopamine levels in the brain. Well, what do you think cocaine is? It's a stimulant. It elevates dopamine levels. So the point I'm making is that a lot of addictions are actually self-medications for specific conditions, right? Like in your case. Now, ADD. Again, the medical mantra around ADD, and I was diagnosed in my 50s, and 2 of my children were diagnosed afterwards. The medical mantra is that it's a genetic brain disease. Well, it isn't genetic, and it's not a brain disease. When you look at the tuning out, the absent-mindedness of ADD, Why do we have that capacity to tune out, do you think? Nature gives us that capacity. We all have that capacity to dissociate, to tune out. Why? Well, it's very simple. If I were to threaten you right now, stress you, abuse you verbally, you would, the number of options available to you. One would be to get up and leave, which is called flight. Or you could stand up and assert yourself and tell me to stop, which is called fight. And if you couldn't do either, given that, how many hundreds of people are here? Okay, so there's 400 people here. You could ask for help. Those would be the functional options. But what if you couldn't escape because you're too small and powerless? What if you couldn't fight back for the same reason? And what if there's nobody to ask for help? Then what would you do? Well, you wouldn't do anything. Your brain would go into an automatic dissociative mode to protect you from the distress. So what it is, it's an adaptation to overwhelming stress. Now, if you put me back into my first year of life, and there are times in the first year of life when every second, like in this space of time, and millions of connections are being made in the brain. What's happening in my first year of life? My mother is stressed. The day after the German army marches into Budapest, when I am 2 months of age, she calls the pediatrician to say, would you please come and see Gabor, because he's crying all the time. And the pediatrician says, well, of course I'll come and see him, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying. Now, why are Jewish babies crying? Well, not because I know anything about Hitler or genocide, but because I'm picking up on my mother's stress. And there's a quote here from one of my teachers that I'd like to read to you, if I can find it. And it says that the child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he's with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. So let's say, what do I do then when my mother is depressed and stressed and terrorized? How do I deal with it? Can I fight back, escape, and ask for help from whom? I tune out. But then the tuning out becomes programmed into my brain. And then 55 years later, or 50 years later, I'm diagnosed with ADHD or ADD. Now, what I'm saying is that and I wasn't abused. Nobody abused me. I just had a depressed and fearful mother. And being a very sensitive, and the more sensitive you are, the more you pick up on that. Mm-hmm. So in those ADD, and if you look at it, it's an adaptation. It begins as an adaptation, which later on becomes a problem. So I'm not saying it's great, I'm saying that it begins as an adaptation, which then becomes a problem. That's the nature. These early adaptations, which children employ, not consciously, to protect themselves from stress, actually become problems later on. Now, if you look at the question of why between 2002 and 2013, I'm being approximate here, the rate of ADD diagnosis in American kids has gone up threefold. What's going on? What's going on is that the parenting environment has become increasingly stressed for all kinds of reasons. And when the parenting environment is stressed, the kids are stressed. And how do they cope with it? They tune out when the brains are developing. Now they're getting diagnosed and medicated and all this mental health crisis. And what we're not looking at is what is it about the environment that actually fosters or foments that response in children. And I'm only talking about ADD. We could talk about anxiety. Right. Because people who are addicted often self-medicate anxiety. They self-medicate it with work, with sex, with TV, with distractions, and of course with drugs. And the New York Times Magazine 2 weeks ago had an article about the burgeoning rate of anxiety in American teenagers, and apparently a third now of teenagers and adults in the United States suffer from anxiety. And why? Well, if it was genetic, it wouldn't be increasing, because genes don't change in a population over 10 years or 20 years or even 100 years. What's happening is that the conditions in which children are growing up is getting more and more stressful, and that has to do with the stress on the parents. And that also has to do, of course, with the workaholism of the parents, like in my case. You know, the world thought I was great. I was out there delivering babies and helping the dying, palliative care, and everything else in between. But what of me did my children receive? Not very much. because I was always the helpless child, and that's the anger that they turned against themselves out of their lives. And one of the ways you do that is through the addiction. You know, and the depression. I mean, what is depression? If you look at, this is interesting again, somebody talked about words. What does it mean to depress something? It means to push it down. When a kid experiences anger, but they can't express it, because to express it is too dangerous, then they push it down. Then they become depressed. So that anger then turns against the self. So if the anger is coming out of them, that's great. But I hope they get some help with it so they can channel it in a healthy way. Rather than, because just keep exploding in rage actually puts you at risk of a heart attack and a stroke. So you might as well take that healthy anger or that rage even and find some channels for it and deal with it.
Yeah, gotcha.
But there's no reason not to be angry at the perpetrator. If that's there, that's nothing more than natural. Take a very tragically well-known case right now, Harvey Weinstein, who clearly had an addiction to sexual predation.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's all kinds of justified outrage at the system that allowed him that enabled him to carry on for so many decades. And people are angry with him, which is totally understandable. But if he came to me for treatment, I would not begin with any kind of a judgment that what you did was bad. He already knows it. I would ask him, like I asked you guys, what did it do for you? What did you get from it that was missing from your life? And what was missing from your life, how did you lose it? What happened to you? In other words, whatever else you do, first of all, you have to accept these people as they are and not judge them, and understand that they were slaves to something inside them. And they didn't willingly make themselves slaves. Number one. Number two, something happened to create that compulsion. And that something that happened that created the compulsion was rooted in pain. And so in other words, you have to treat them with compassion, and you have to actually get to the core trauma rather than just dealing with the behavior. And the problem with all the many programs, Betty Ford and elsewhere, people go for all these high-end, expensive treatments, rarely do they deal with the trauma. And even in the 12-step programs, they rarely deal with the trauma. They just, David Smith, who's a physician in San Francisco, who founded the Haight-Ashbury Clinic back in the 60s, he said to me once that the medical profession is traumaphobic. So is the whole of society. We're surrounded by trauma and the manifestations of trauma, which show up in the culture, from politics to every other field, and yet we don't talk about trauma. But dealing with the trauma, yeah. I want to distinguish two kinds of trauma. So there's overt trauma, then there's what we call developmental trauma. And we have two very great examples of it in the United States. So what does trauma do? It separates us from ourselves. We lose ourselves, like we said. It also gives us a very negative view of the world. So if we have a negative view of the world, then we act accordingly. We are defensive, and we're grandiose, and we're aggressive. So there's a man who said that the world is a horrible place. Now, I'm not commenting on anybody's politics here. I'm talking pure psychology. Okay? I'm not talking about policy, foreign or domestic. I'm talking about mind states. Please understand that. So however you voted in this last election, don't take offense, please. But the man who said that the world is a horrible place is the President of the United States. And that's the world he lives in. And why does he live in that world? Because he grew up in a family that taught him that. His father was a domineering, rageaholic a tyrant who demeaned his children. His brother drank himself to death. And this man develops all these issues like attention problems and grandiosity, and psychiatrists have diagnosed him with narcissism and all this kind of stuff, which are not false, they're the outcomes of trauma. So there's that overt trauma. And we live in such a traumatized society that these people actually rise to the top. But his opponent was even more interesting. I don't know if you saw the Democratic National Convention, and when Hillary won the nomination, there was a video narrated about her life by God himself, Morgan Freeman.
Our children, they look up to us.
Now, how many of you saw that video about her life? Now, there was something very interesting in that video that I saw no comments on whatsoever. This anecdote comes from Hillary, and what happens is that, and it's presented as an example of wonderful character building, strength building, parenting. What happens is that the 4-year-old Hillary runs into her home to her mother, afraid because neighborhood kids are bullying her, threatening her. And the mother says, "There is no room for cowards in this house. Now you get out there and you deal with it." And this is presented as, this made me tough, and this made me a fighter, and this is character building. Now, the actual message to the child is not that there's no room for cowards in this house, because the 4-year-old or 5-year-old who runs to mom is only doing what any mammal will do, any young mammal will do when they're threatened, is they'll go to their protective figures. It's not cowardice, it's just natural attachment. The message is, there's no room for your vulnerability in this house. You have to be tough. You have to suck it up. Now, jump 65 years ahead, and the presidential campaign, and there's a famous scene where Trump is looming all over, hovering all over Hillary, and she doesn't say a thing. She's just sucking it up. And then she develops pneumonia. Remember during the campaign she had pneumonia? How did the world find out that she had pneumonia? Because she collapsed, and her security people had to pick her up. But she didn't tell anybody about it. She didn't talk about it because she learned at an early age to suck it up, and she mustn't be vulnerable. So what I'm saying, and that's what's called developmental trauma, where not when something bad happens to you, but when the good things that should happen don't happen. And the good thing that didn't happen is the mother should have scooped her up and said, "Oh boy, you're really scared, aren't you?" That's what didn't happen. And so what I'm saying is that there's that overt trauma, and there's lots of studies on how overt trauma, if those of you are not familiar with the adverse childhood experiences studies, the AC studies, where they looked at 17,000 Californians, half of them university graduates, and the more adversity there was in their childhood, meaning physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, death of a parent, a divorce, parent being addicted, a parent being mentally ill, violence in the family, neglect, a parent being jailed. For each of these adverse experiences, the risk of addiction goes up exponentially. And you can download your ACE score just by going to the internet. It'll give you a lot of insight about yourself. But there's that other kind of trauma, which is the developmental trauma, which doesn't happen because bad things happen to you, but just because you weren't held in the way you needed to be held. So that's the final thing I wanted to tell you.